Welcome to Grounded Theory Unbound, a podcast about all things grounded theory. This podcast is hosted by the Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University. I'm your host, Dr. Nicky van Bechel. In today's episode, I'm talking to Dr. Laura Biggs. Laura is a research fellow at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute at the Royal Children's Hospital in Victoria, Australia. Laura recently contributed 2 vignettes to the 3rd edition of Grounded Theory, a practical guide written by friends of the podcast Melanie Birks and Jane Mills. One of these vignettes focused on theoretical coding and how to use storyline in relation to this. At the ARU Grounded Theory Network, we regularly get questions about theoretical coding, so I felt that a conversation with Laura was a great opportunity to unpick some of the things related to it. There is a study guide for this podcast episode, the link of which is in the show notes. Before we continue, I'd like to note that Laura's grounded theory research addresses issues of maternal mental health and suicide, and therefore there is reference to this in this episode. Everyone listens to Grounded Theory Unbound with their own life experiences, and some may find these topics distressing and/or upsetting. If this is you, please find a number of support options for you in the show notes should you feel you need them, and please do get in touch with feedback if you feel we could have managed this better. Laura, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for making time to come and chat to us about theoretical coding. Instead of me introducing you, I'm going to let you. So if you wouldn't mind, a bit of a quick one about you, but also about how you ended up doing grounded theory, and then we can piggyback on there to theoretical coding and the topic of today. So who is Laura?
Awesome. I love that I can try and get that down into a quick one. No, I will condense it further from who is Laura. Thank you for having me, Nikki. So me in a nutshell, I'm now working as a research fellow in the Intergenerational Health Group at a medical research institute here called MCRI. So we're Murdoch Children's Research Institute. We're based on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in also known as Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. So for us as a research group, we specialise in understanding and intervening in cycles of intergenerational trauma. And that's where my work has landed now. But I came to this via my practice as a midwife. So I have a background in clinical practice and also education. But I've been in this group now for coming up 5 years. So that's my work now. But I came to grounded theory kind of on the back of my PhD. So my PhD was in perinatal mental health. I have always had this fascination with grounded theory, but didn't manage to use it in my PhD, but had my eyes on it. I remember we had some conversations about it, but I just didn't kind of get the bites. And honestly, for that project, that was probably the right way to go. But then when we were talking about, I was probably only 6 months out of the PhD, and a funding opportunity came up, and this particularly was around suicide prevention. And there's an enormous gap in our knowledge relating to maternal suicide and this maternal suicide prevention. So when we were talking about, do we want to apply for some funding and what would we do, grounded theory was absolutely where my brain went. So we were very fortunate to get an innovation grant from Suicide Prevention Australia. And that was my opportunity to first, after many years of annoying her with many questions, to be able to work with Professor Melanie Birks. So she's been dealing with me ever since.
I'm quite sure annoying is probably not the right word. That's all good. So when you say you didn't get the chance to do grounded theory, was that by choice or just because it just never occurred, or was it you were actively avoiding it because it was scary?
It's a brilliant question, and I think it's probably a combination of all of those things in some respects. I think by the time I was able to articulate my curiosity with it, my PhD had moved a particular, way through, and it was probably a bananas thing to try and think about, trying to do at that late stage. As far as I'm aware, it's not something that the profs that I did my PhD with were familiar with either. So there was lots of reasons why it wasn't going to be a good fit. But I think you do touch on a really important point. I'd always had this sense that it was this enormous, complex, gargantuan undertaking. And so as much as I'd always been fascinated and attracted to the methodology, it had felt this enormous mountain that I was going to have to climb if I ever managed to find a way to actually use it.
And yet here we are, talking grounded theory via a maternal mental health project. So you came into it probably a bit later than most people I've spoken to so far, because you didn't do it during your doctoral journey, whereas a lot of people do. you came to it as a postdoc. So tell me a bit about how that happened, because you just mentioned you applied for funding for a project. The project got funded. It happened. So tell me more about that. How did
Mm.
that then lead to grounded theory, and why was grounded theory a fit there? And then after that, how did that affect you as an early career researcher?
Brilliant questions. So we knew that we wanted to get to the heart of what it was that was happening for women and their families at this time. So we knew we needed a brilliant design, a strong methodology. The perinatal period, that process of becoming pregnant, having a baby, welcoming a new baby into your world, that is a process in and of itself. And so it lended itself beautifully to the methodology and what it could do in trying to then understand what people were experiencing across time. So we thought if we're going to understand the way suicide evolves at this time, which is itself also a process, it just made perfect sense. And I suspect Melanie being, even though technically we'd never worked together in inverted commas, she's always been a brilliant mentor and supporter of me. So when the funding opportunity first popped up, and I thought it was ludicrous, right? Because I was 6 months out of a PhD, assumed I would have to apply for at least another 10, 20 grants before I would
Yeah.
get one. So in my mind, I was like, this is a great learning opportunity. I'll design something that inspires me. And that would enable me to work with people who also inspire me. And, I'll just keep chipping away kind of thing. And then, gosh, when we actually got the funding, it was, to answer the second part of your question about what that's meant for me impact wise, it's kind of like coming home. I feel like I have found my place I feel like I've always researched the right things, if that makes sense, but the methodology is very much like coming home. I feel like I've found something, gives me the tools that enables me to understand things in the way that I really want to, but also I think to do justice to these really complex things that happen in our worlds and in people's lives. I think this is the
Mm.
right tool for that job.
Yeah. And of course, you kind of landed in a really, really nice spot there, because you've got a very sensible grounded theorist as a supervisor in that relationship. So steep learning curve, probably somewhat less steep, or given the right tools to climb it, which is great. What were the first bits like in like getting your head around grounded theory when you first realized, when you thought, oh, now I need to go and do grounded theory, now what? Because that's the
Well,
bit that
here's
intrigued me. So I came into this as a bioscientist, and then I had
mm,
to learn grounded theory, and that was a bit of a but it made perfect sense in the end, because the systematic nature of it
mm,
just really fitted well with me. I'm very much still in a post-positivist camp. I still have, I'd say, half now of my brain being still a bioscientist. It's slowly eroding away, but we're still a little bit there. So that kind of made sense. But you mentioned coming home. I mean, surely it wouldn't have felt like that in the first period. Like the grounded theory honeymoon period is probably not equally fun for everyone.
it was a bit of a wild time. So the other contextual piece here is I graduated from my PhD in December of 2018. We landed this funding December 2019. I
Mm.
just moved to MCRI in the October. I was like, woohoo, dream, got the grant, got the new job, absolutely nailing it. And then, of course, we all know what happened in
Yeah.
early 2020, don't we? Um, and so the city where I live had some of the longest lockdowns in the world over the next 2.5 years. And so, as much as I'm incredibly proud of this project, it was a product of its time in some respects, and I don't think the theory is necessarily a product of its time, but the way that we were able to collaborate as a research team. We've never all been in one room together.
Yeah.
And I still feel like that's one of my greatest failings. I'm like, I must put the people in the room to do research that was this sensitive and this
Mm.
important. And for me, it was my first time as a, so-called CIA, and really needing Mel's mentoring around, well, how do I do this grounded theory thing? To then overlay the way that we were all disconnected and trying to understand how to feel connected and supported with each other while we did this. I was very curious, but I think we did incredibly well. But
Mm.
the enormity of learning grounded theory, to be honest, I think was soon dwarfed by okay, I need to learn grounded theory in this context. And gee, why didn't I pick an easier topic? This sense of who wants to talk about suicide in a pandemic? You bananas, what are the chances of people wanting to speak to us? And we actually found, I don't necessarily think that the pandemic influenced this, but we found that people were very keen to speak. And I think what we see in mental health research broadly is that people are quite motivated to share experiences. There is a drive to support other people who might have similar experiences and generate a sense of not necessarily good, but a sense of having contributed to something and to share that wisdom, to benefit communities really.
Yeah, it was a funny period, wasn't it? I mean, I distinctly remember it. I started my grounded theory research pre-pandemic, and then
Mm.
probably a third of the way in, I had to switch the whole project online, which ended up not being a big deal because at the same time I was teaching and I had to switch all my teaching online. So I was already doing it anyway. And
Mm.
therefore, for all my participants who were all higher education academics who have just shifted their whole life online, it was just natural progression and it didn't affect it very much. So I think that the impact of it, I mean, there's a lot of philosophizing happening around it at the moment, and there were at the
Mm.
time, and we've got some very interesting papers out there on interviewing online versus in person, blah, blah. But I think overall, I think that the research done, I mean, it would have been pretty much similar, I think, anyway. Just the way we did it was different, wasn't it?
Totally agree.
So you did that study, and then you got towards the end of it, and then you came to the theoretical coding part, and then we ended up with a bit that is now a very, very cool example in a seminal work on grounded theory. So tell me about theoretical coding for this particular project.
It's going to sound super weird, but I kind of did it before I realized I was doing it. And I think in some respects, I had this sense that I wasn't as progressed as I was with my storyline. I remember sending it to, that around that time where I was starting to pull it together and wanting to really land, I guess, on that idea of a core category and all that sort of testing and extending that you do through the use of storyline. I thought I was still a lot way further down that mountain than I actually was. So by the time I think I realized where I was up to in, hey, I can call what I'm now doing applying this theoretical code and actually is making a lot more sense to people outside of my immediate brain than I had anticipated. I had already been looking out there, I guess, in terms of seeing if some of the literature I was aware of could help to
Mm.
explain what it was that we were seeing in the storyline. And so, yeah, I think a slight accident. It's funny that's not in Mel and Jane's book, but I do remember, and I think this is part of the anecdote that's in there where I messaged Melanie and said, I think the core category is shame. I got this beautiful response, so typical of the time, which was just Glazer would urge patience. I remember looking at it thinking, I suppose he would. Seems on point. Went back and kept digging, and I spent such a long time. I think that was probably part of it too. It was like, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't give into that temptation to collapse and lose the detail and declare it all over because you're sick of looking at the butcher's paper, literally covering every single wall of your study at this point. You've just got to sit in the mess. And so I think that enabled me to play around, I guess, with some of the theoretical coding potentials without feeling like I had all of this pressure on me that I was on this last stage, if that makes sense.
It does, and I'm glad you referred to it because I was literally, as you were saying it, I was picking up the page, and it's like, well, so it does exactly. The words are, I'm pretty sure shame is our core category, and then Glazer would encourage patience. Now, yes, he would say that, wouldn't he? But then I guess it's the key to grounded theory very much is not rushing it in this case, and I think particularly around this theoretical coding stage is where once you think you've got a core category, you go and do this theoretical coding thing, but that's a big step. That's a big thing because you kind of put your stamp down at that point and you start reaching out. So I guess patience is key.
Mm.
Um, but if we can just take a bit of a step back because I mean in the section in the book it says that you've had this thing where you said, okay, so there must be something here. But what was the bit leading up to that like? Because
Mm.
obviously you're going through these, what I presume were transcripts, you're coding away, you're doing your intermediate coding, and then you get this spark. Think, hold on a minute, there is something here.
So we used a bit of an interesting approach to the way that we generated data, and I'm just so glad that we did. And it's on my wish list for this year that I finally need to get around to writing this paper because I think it's really important. To begin with, we generated data with participants using anonymous testimonials or short surveys. And I know that can be a bit contentious in grounded theory research, but what that enabled us to do, you can imagine women. So, just a bit of background, our inclusion criteria was women who had experience of suicidality either in their pregnancy or the following year, regardless of the outcome of that pregnancy. And we did limit it to Australia just in terms of being able to make references to health system issues and that kind of jazz. And we limited it to 5 years, really just to have a little bit of an eye on kind of pragmatic reasons around health system design, but also because we weren't sure what we're going to get. It was the first research of its kind in Australia, so we weren't sure interest really. But we'd said to folks, you can participate anonymously. And I think for women and families who do have concerns around things like child protection, there can be people in their lives that will unfortunately use mental health experiences to try and gain custody of children. There can be concerns about identity relating to work or professional roles, anything like the ability when we're researching sensitive things to give people a way to share either their whole experience, or even just for us to create a space where they can share a bit that if we made them name themselves, they wouldn't be able to bring into the theory, I think really only helps us. We did get a bit of pushback on peer review, this notion that you can't theoretically sample testimonials, which obviously doesn't stack up given that theoretical sampling is a combination of lines of inquiry within your coding as well as interviews. But we used those testimonials. We had 119 of them to form our draft theory. And then we undertook a series of in-depth interviews to test and extend that draft theory. So I think with a bit you might be referencing here is even just in looking at those testimonials, we started to see a really striking pattern in this conclusion that women were narrating that they had reached earlier in their experiences, that their families would be better off without them. And what was so striking about it was not just how often it came up, but the consistency of the terms that women were using to describe that. And it was better off without. And there would often be a little bit of framing around how they had arrived at that. But it became quite clear then early in my coding that we needed to be able to generate a theory to explain how people arrived at that conclusion and how they progressed beyond it. And what sat around the conclusion were those notions of defectiveness, not being good enough, not possessing what it takes to be a good mum, and the real feeling that they weren't going to be able to generate that it was beyond them. Hence that feeling of being stuck and of needing to escape, and that it was an immovable barrier, if you will, which was what enabled that conclusion. Hence, shame ended up becoming the thread through all of this that we felt could explain how people arrived there.
It's still funny that I always get a bit irky with people that say, "Oh, you can't do that in grounded theory." But well, of course you can, because Glaser's most important nugget is all his data. So why wouldn't you, right? So, I'm glad you chose to ignore them and just got on with it, because otherwise we wouldn't have been sitting here and you wouldn't have produced the work that you did. You found that core category and you decided to go do some reading and you found something that resonated. And from the section in the book, from the writing, it is so immensely clear that it was a proper light bulb. Dang, this works moment. So where did you go from there? Because we're talking theoretical coding. So you've ended up using an extant theory and I'm going to say applied it to, and I know it's not quite that because it's more subtle than that, but you've taken an extant theory and applied it or merged it or kind of integrated it into your own work to come up with your theory, right? How did that happen?
Bit of background, the extant theory we've used is by an author that if you had said to me in December 2019 when we got the funding that I would be applying this theoretical code, my response would have been something along the lines of, well, Future for Laura's lost her brain because that's just no. I'm not sure if you've looked at it, who it is, who wrote this theory, Nikki. It's Brene Brown. TED Talk famous. I think there's this sense that, folks who maybe end up viral don't always have the intellectual kind of foundation behind them, which is obviously unfair. but there is a worry about what is viral, but also I think the sense that you have to get the good theoretical code, that you have to go back in the academic trenches, that maybe it'll be some dusty book from 1906 that's got the good oil or something, that it couldn't be something that's so readily available. And also, I've read a few of her books before this point, so I didn't think it would be something that would already be contained within my working brain. So um, when I found it, it was her grounded theory from 2006, which was a study interviewing 215 women. And it was focused on understanding why and how women experience shame and what they do, what strategies they use to develop shame resilience, basically. And in reading it, exactly as you say, total light bulb moment. It was holy moly. This is the heart of what we are hearing. And it was similar enough that I felt like I hadn't completely ballsed up this project, which, of course, when you're doing such sensitive work and when you have asked people to share with you, there is that burden of, I really want to do this justice. Please let me do the right thing with these stories. So I was quite tentative and worried at that point that maybe I hadn't done it justice. We'd really pretty much finished forming the storyline, at least in its first iteration, by this sense. And I was hugely relieved and excited to then see so much of what we were seeing was reflected in Brown's theory, but also that we had clearly extended it. That we were not simply saying the same thing 20 years later and failing to do anything useful. It was a real wowzers. This shows up here in a really new and important way.
And I think that's it, isn't it? And you're going through this stage of, right, I've done all this work and I've got this responsibility to my participants to do this right and to make sure that it is, you're struggling with this. Is this just me? Am I making this up? And I
Yes.
mean, I had this very similar experience where I did all this work and I came up with this combination of like three core categories that kind of interacted with each other. And there wasn't just one that grabbed it all, because there were three that came in it from slightly different angles, contributing factors, that kind of stuff. And then I just stumbled across a paper that just was a paper on whether the theory of planned behavior can be used to explain evidence-based practice behavior in allied health professionals. And this was written by Melanie in Melbourne, right? And I read this paper and I thought, and found the same stuff, but in a whole different group of professionals in a completely different world and environment. Is this what it's all about? So I need to look more into this theory of planned behaviors. And I had to dive back into a 1991 paper that was written by Eisen, and there was an organizational behavior paper. And but you know what? Yes, in essence, what I'm looking at is how people operate within an organization. So this might, and then it turns out that this is one of the most seminal planned behavior papers in the world. And I had this very same thing where you went, yeah, when I started this, I would have never considered an organizational behavior paper in an educational leadership context. And like, what? But that's the beauty of grounded theory, isn't it? You can use extant theories from different fields. And as you said, I feel like I've extended stuff by applying it to a completely new context, new field. And it fits. And it fitted beautifully. And it explained it beautifully. And on the back of that, I could make some really strong recommendations to the organization in which I did my research. Right? And it's that weaving of your own findings and your own thoughts into something that's there, which is why when I read the sections in the book, everyone's like, yeah, do you know what? Actually, it very much felt like that. It's this light bulb thing of, dang, yes, this is it. But I'm also aware it's probably not like that for everyone.
No,
Right? Not
I
everyone has got light
definitely.
bulbs. Some people, it's a slow grind.
Yes, and I think that's such an important part to narrate as well, because um, I could have just as easily taken months to find this. Like if I hadn't come up through the field that I had, I think I originally was exposed to Brené's stuff. I mean, aside from the whole 65 million views on, literally, I looked it up today, it's 65.5 or 6.6 million views on her first TED Talk, whereas her paper has only got 1,036 references. So they've been cited a bit over 1,000 times. So I'm not sure we're in the right field, Nikki, but it could have taken me longer to find it. But I think what I love about theoretical coding is it feels like this is kind of what we are meant to be doing with our work anyway, which is taking the time to diligently think about how we can use what is already in existence to help us understand and strengthen what it is that we're now doing. And I feel like modern academia has just pushed us to a place now where we're so often just citing folks in our own immediate academic ecosystem. So often I see things popping up as ideas in public health, and it's framed up as this very, very new and groundbreaking thing. But I'm quite sure folks in humanities have been publishing about it for the last 20 years and laugh at us.
That annoys me so much when you see things as new and say, there's nothing new about this. We've been doing this for years in a different field. Go read
That's
wider,
it.
people.
100%. Yep. And it's a gift. It's a gift to be told exactly as you said before. We get a lovely structure from grounded theory. It's not too directive. We can apply the methods in ways that fits our paradigm and our context and the way that we're operating, in collaborative teams, but it does say no.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I shouldn't say universally. I know not everyone's on board with theoretical coding, but when it is applied, it is that, particularly I think for PhD students or HDR students, it's that permission structure to go out there and to think outside the box, to really become familiar with different traditions. And I think that's a wonderful thing for us to be cultivating in the future researchers of our environments, really.
It's the strength of the conceptual nature of grounded theory, isn't it? Because once you're on at a conceptual plane, stuff suddenly starts making sense, because as long as things are conceptually similar, then it's all fair game, right? It's like, yeah, this is the same thing. It doesn't matter where it came from. Conceptually, this is the same. So let's play with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the beauty of, I think, what we do. Now, from reading the thing, it all sounded like it was all dandy and all went fine. Were there things and moments where you thought, what in the world am I doing? Or this is not working?
I mean, yes, they didn't probably pertain quite so much to the theoretical coding stage because I think this was a bit of an easier kind of time. I definitely think having come up, so my PhD was primarily qualitative. That doesn't, I think, always mean that we get the muscle memory that we need when it comes to approaches to coding. It was a far larger data set than I had had before as well, just in terms of the number of humans I needed to try and hold, 139. So I think in those early days, it was that trepidation about how do I stay true to what people are sharing? How do I find, and I think David Morgan was even speaking about this in the last episode, not wanting to move into the interpretive space too soon, but you obviously don't want 50 million in vivo codes. Then you become overwhelmed and attached to and can't progress beyond. So I think for me that was the bit of the study that challenged me the most. And once I had found my confidence and started to get my stride around that, it did come together really well. And I should here also reference my colleagues. So this study was undertaken in partnership with a national perinatal mental health service, and the colleagues I had around me who were really involved, in particular in undertaking these interviews, they sit on Panda's national helpline day in, day out, and they're having these conversations with women and families. So they were truly listening to their interviews was such a gift for me as a researcher to learn how they created those spaces of safety that enabled women to come as they were and share in whatever way was going to be safe for them. Just beautiful skills. And I think that really helped us as we were then trying to pull our theory together, because I had this incredibly skilled but also invested group of people around me who would do an interview, do some sketching, text me pictures. I could pitch where I was up to in terms of my categories. Just such helpful sounding boards to have around me as well. And I think that really made a difference as I started to build my own confidence too.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? So I hear this from a lot of people, particularly like PGRs, like PhD students, doctoral students, on how not everyone's in the luxury of having a grounded theory supervisor or supportive person around them, which is, I guess, why in ARU Grounded Theory Network, we're trying to be as supportive as we can to everyone. Just even if you don't have a home where you are, you can always find a home with us. And that's part of it, is that having that support around you to use as a soundboard and to make sure that what you're doing is sensible, particularly when it comes to those last stages of actually explaining everything and making it make sense, because that's effectively what theoretical coding is, isn't it? It's making it make sense and seeing how the final bits of the puzzle fit in. So I guess what did that look like for you in practice? So you said you had that light bulb moment, you found this paper, you think, do you know what, this pretty well works. What in practice, how did you then take that and merge it into what you were doing, and I guess come to the final bit of the work, which was the final like substantive grounded theory?
So to draw back on that reflection I was sharing before about trying to understand how women arrive at the conclusion that their families would be better off without them and how they progress beyond that conclusion. That was what we had at that time. So to that, it was almost like a bit of a hinge point in the theory and then pathway beyond. So that question of whether to be, what Brown's grounded theory spoke about was shame as being about questions of who, what, and how to be. Beautifully positioned shame as being driven by socio-political and cultural context, and also framed up that there are particularly shame-prone times in women's lives, or I think Brené wrote about them as being shame triggers. So things like appearance, body image, family, career, motherhood, sexuality, mental health, and also surviving trauma. And they are all things that we had within our theory in terms of cycles of intergenerational trauma being a key pathway where shame can be really difficult perinatal experiences, again, being a domain where women felt like they had failed their families, their bodies had failed them. That, if you have a baby who might be born early, for example, it's really hard not to blame yourself. So it was a little bit like we had, and I've been trying so hard to find a metaphor because I'm such a visual kind of learner. And it was a little bit like we had spent, maybe doing a quite complex puzzle over here. And that feeling when you get your next bit of your puzzle piece and it just fits, you're not having to cram it into the, space,
Yeah, yeah.
and all the colors line up and it's very satisfying. It was a little bit like I had built our puzzle piece. And then when I started to move my eyes to the horizon to think about what else is out there, it truly was like being able to position it around what we already had. There was no needing to shave off bits of our theory. We did not touch what was already there. What we were able to do, though, is show how and at what points of our theory questions of who, what, and how to be lined up with ours, again, without shaving anything off. And we didn't need to wrangle what Brené had done in hers, but we then used that framing of who, what, and how to be to extend to the question of whether to, and to show the way that shame showed up in that question, which we felt was a nice extension or kind of growing of what Brené had done in her theory. So there are the two diagrams that are in the book. One is showing our theory, as it's been published, and the other is more of a technical diagram that shows where our theory sits, but also those key parts where the theoretical code intersect and are really extended.
Yeah, and I'll add those into the show notes and in the study guide for this episode, because they're very intriguing diagrams. I guess they very nicely illustrate how that theoretical coding worked, particularly in relation to the storyline that you've got, and I guess it illustrates the process quite nicely. So you've done that once, right? You've finished off this maternal suicide project. You've done your theoretical coding. You had this light bulb moment, and you're now still doing grounded theory stuff. So how is that, doing it once? What's been the impact of that on your current grounded theory work? I mean, what are you currently working on, and is there an impact?
Definitely. There's a couple of angles I'd probably come at that question from. The first one is to just acknowledge how incredible the mentoring that I had from Mel and how much that has influenced the way that I now mentor people. We talk a lot about trusting this process of grounded theory, right? And that it's this weird leap of faith. And, the fact that qualitative research can just challenge people anyway because there's all this ambiguity and uncertainty. And I think I would also add that it is a challenge because sometimes, certainly in my field, you just feel like a leper anyway. I'm based in a medical research institute. I'm not sure if this, I hope it's not reflected in your continent, Nikki, but I suspect it might be. Early in my career, there was this really strong messaging of if you want a career, do not be solely a qualitative researcher because you will very quickly fade out of relevance. You will very quickly stop being funded. And truly, what's the point anyway? And certainly in public health or health research, that's been the messaging. So it feels like you're signing up for this difficult to defend, difficult to do thing that often needs defending and kind of protecting. So yeah, the good mentoring, the brilliant mentoring in that environment, which can sometimes frankly feel hostile, is absolutely critical. And now that I have finished one, I can see the way that Melanie was always there when I needed her, but didn't overstep. So what I think I've realized is critical for people doing grounded theory, and what I'm really hoping I'm able to do in the projects where I'm acting more as a methodological mentor is letting people take their own journey, but helping them build trust in that by sort of being there and to be able to say, oh, I've just noticed we might be going a little bit awry here and maybe we need to do a bit of tweaking, or maybe have you thought about this too? Or it's the scaffolding without the micromanaging, but it's that watchful sort of, I've got your back. I believe in your capacity to do this, but I'm also not going to leave you high and dry. So you get 18 months in and realize what you've got is not a grounded theory.
Yeah, and I guess there's multiple angles to this, isn't there? There is the doing the grounded theory, and there is the grounded theory process. And as you say, you, it's always a bit of a leap of faith because you learn grounded theory by doing it. And that's scary because you can't really explain everything. You can't learn about this stuff by reading about it. At some point, you just have to go and do it, right? And this is where it can be really intimidating. And having we've said this before, having a supportive network around you is key. And I think the fact that you've experienced that, and then you've had this positive experience at the end, and it all suddenly made sense, taking that experience forward, both in the supervisory capacity, but also in your next personal research journey, I think is really interesting. And it's particularly, it's, I guess, key to being a good researcher, isn't it? It's that. And I'm glad to say qualitative research in a, I guess, in a medical, but also, I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm doing qualitative research in a science department. I'm the only qualitative researcher in the whole department. Yeah, I know exactly what that's like. But equally, it makes for interesting arguments. And having to defend yourself is, in a way, is always like sharpening your sword, isn't it? It's like you'll always make sure that you're ready with the arguments, but it is really difficult. And having your own good network around you allows you to be that good network for other people. So yeah, it's great. And it's amazing what completing one grounded theory study can do for your confidence of being a grounded theorist. See one, do one, teach one, isn't it, in the medical sciences? And in
Yes,
medicine, it very much feels like that at the moment.
yes, definitely. And I've just realized actually something that I should have referenced before when I was speaking about the theoretical coding, and I'll try not to ramble on it too much, but I do feel like it's helpful. When I was finding my feet to be able to say this is definitely the theoretical code, I was looking out there at other things to try and challenge myself. And there is highly prevalent and impactful theory of suicide. It's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And so I was like, who am I to pull this, Renee's a social worker by background. Who am I to ignore this extant theory of suicide and apply this instead? And I was trying to understand why it was that it just had no resonance, really, or very, very, very limited resonance with what we had in front of us. And there's this beautiful critique of that theory published by a couple of Norwegian academics, which beautifully summed it up, that they were um, coming at the question of suicide and suicidality and how we support people from what they termed as different epistemological planets. And they nailed it, that this was the thing. The folks who generated that theory had got a bunch of experts together, looked at the risk factors identified in the epidemiological, and generated a theory not from folks with lived experience, but from people who were medical professionals trying to explain the way risk factors might be operationalized in people's lives. And what you have is something that is boiled down to what they feel are the three key elements of what it is to basically have suicide risk, or to be at risk of dying by suicide, and it just doesn't have resonance. And it is the different almost paradigm planets. And I do think that's a helpful thing for us to keep in mind when we start to think about applying theoretical codes or gaining our own confidence, um, is to remember that not all theory is theory generated from the planet that will align necessarily with ours and with our own ambitions, particularly given if our grounded theory work is coming from more of a critical or social justice lens, it may not stack up with what's already out there.
And I guess that's where grounded theory comes from, the data, right? It comes from the participants, it comes from the data, and it will then, in your theoretical coding, you will say, okay, so if something's out there that doesn't fit, why does it not fit? Right? And then you go on that investigative journey and say, okay, well, it doesn't fit. There's a reason it doesn't fit. Cool. Now we've got two theories, one coming from participants, one coming from non-participants. And now I guess the next step there is then just to see if they are supplementing each other, or whether one is more right than the other, if you will. And I guess that's doing research, isn't it? That's finding new
Absolutely.
things. That was your novel contribution, is that it came from the participants. Yeah, it's the lived experience part of this, and only grounded theory could have done that. Yeah. And I guess
Sorry for the
that's
tangent.
no, it's important, right? Who are we as people who've not experienced it to tell those who have what they're feeling, right? You can't.
Mm.
And you see that so often. So I think going to the source and generating theory from the data is the right thing to do there, even though in certain areas of research it's just not appreciated. Well, we'll just have to fight harder. We're right, they're not. Simple. And I can say that. And of course there are exceptions, and there is great research being done, but it needs to be done for the right reasons, and the right reasons are not always the same for every context. Right, so came to this talking about grounded theory and theoretical coding. If you had to give the one tip that rules them all around theoretical coding to other grounded theory researchers, what would that one tip to rule them all be?
Goodness, the one tip to rule them all. It's a lot of pressure. I'm going to give two parts to this, if that's cool, and I'll reference
Yeah, that's fair enough.
a project I'm doing now that has made me not reconsider, but it's made me develop a little bit more humility. So my one tip to rule them all would have been to trust your gut, because I do think it's an intuitive process, and I think not not imagining that our gut's going to that it will feel immediately right, if that makes sense, but I think trusting that it once you've done the digging that you need to do and that you will land in the right place. That if you'd asked me right after I come out of my last experience, that's what I would have said. I'm going to quickly reference the grounded theories that I'm involved in now, if that's cool, because I feel like that's a little bit of why my thinking has evolved. So I'm incredibly fortunate to be involved in four different grounded theory studies at the moment, three where I'm providing support in terms of the methodology, and one where I'm more involved in theory generation. So one is by my PhD student, Anita Kanga Parabia. She's a genetic counsellor looking at processes of culturally safe perinatal genetic screening for Indian migrant communities here in Victoria, from the perspective of folks who've had a pregnancy in the state and have been offered genetic screening in the last 10 years, and also the health professionals that are working alongside those families. She's generating data in three different languages. So it'll be English, Punjabi, and Hindi. She's working in partnership with a community researcher who is also connected to the community, as is Anita. And so I think one of my lessons, if we try and apply it from that study, although Anita's not quite up to that stage, she has started generating data, is that our guts, when we're working in cross-cultural and cross landscapes, our guts can tell us different things in different ways. And Anita's gut will be on point because she's part of community and she's a genetic counsellor herself. But if it was me in that data set, my gut wouldn't quite be tailored in the same way, because I have more of an outsider, a position in that. And so I would have to approach that theoretical coding very differently if that was me. Another project, which is a grounded theory, which is embedded in a cohort study, which is now doing 18-year follow-up with the children of the mothers who were first recruited. So this is called the Mothers and Young People Study. They recruited 1,507 first-time mums. Those children are now turning 18 and 19.
Wow.
And they've been doing, I know, how cool is it? I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to hang out with these very cool people, and they let me annoy them with my grounded theory nerdery. But they're interviewing the young people to try and understand how they navigate adversity as they transition to young adulthood. So again, if I was to speak to theoretical coding there, I was once a young person, but I've never been a young person in this context now, right? I had COVID in my teens, not my teens. The world looks very different. So again, I'd have to be cautious and understand the way my gut might be taking me in particular directions. And then finally, the other two projects. One is a PhD student of mine, Helen Kennedy, who is an incredible Aboriginal researcher who's looking at processes of Aboriginal-led kinship care and family reunification for Koori communities here in Victoria. So supporting her methodologically. And then the other project that I'm more involved in terms of coding and theory generation is called Nagaji Ngulu Muratura, and that's looking at healing and recovery from child sexual abuse for Aboriginal survivors, again, in Koori communities here in Victoria. So I'm not an Aboriginal researcher myself. So in the context of those two projects, I have to be very, very mindful of drawing on my own understanding of the world and experiences of adversity in ways that build empathy, but also can see the spaces where I might have blind spots. And of course, both projects have strong Aboriginal governance and leadership. So I'm feeling, in particular with Nagaji, where I'm probably going to be a lot more involved with theoretical coding, curious to see how that's going to work in practice, because I know my gut can't lead me in the same way as it was able to lead me in the maternal suicide work. So I think to go back to your original question about the number one tip to rule them all, trust your gut, but also invest in your gut is probably it. It's that sense of knowing who you are as a researcher and what brings you to the work, what sustains you in the work, finding the spaces to be reflective, the people around you who will bring the honesty and who will have your back, so that you can operate in really thoughtful ways as you're doing that final theory construction.
Yeah, I like that. That sounds good. Trust your gut, but also develop your gut. And I guess by extension, and I am going to extend that then by one, is trust the process,
Yes.
right? Trust your gut. And if you're not sure, you can develop your gut and trust the process, right? Because that's what it
And
comes
make
down to.
Yes, and make sure, I think a really key part, as we were speaking before about trusting the process, is knowing you've got the right people in your
Mm.
corner so that you
Yes.
can almost surrender to said process. And I think it's so important, exactly as you were saying before, not everyone has a grounded theorist on their supervision panel. And if I could change one thing in the world, it would be that, because that can be a very, very lonely place for people. Yeah,
Yeah.
you need that person in your corner.
Everyone deserves one. Because
Yes,
we're awesome.
I agree completely.
Right. I think we're there. I think I'm going to leave you
Hope
to
I
your
didn't ramble
evening.
too much, Nikki.
No, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. As I said, I'll make sure the relevant things are in the show notes in the study guide. Um, it's been awesome. Theoretical coding is such a cool part of grounded theory because it's where it all starts making sense, right? And it's where
This
you
is
put everything in context and the wider world, and that makes it very exciting. So thank you
Yes,
so much for your time.
just such a genuine pleasure. I don't always get to feel like I'm with my people. You know what it's like when you have to be a bit of a chameleon. So I just so appreciate the opportunity, and I'm really hoping that I can connect more with your network.
Oh, absolutely do. I know the time difference is a bit of a pain sometimes, but
Yeah.
you're always welcome. Thank you very much. This was Grounded Theory Unbound. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you have any feedback, or if you would like to feature on the podcast to talk about your way of doing grounded theory, please get in touch with us using the details in the show notes. Tune back in next month for our next episode. Bye!